in the reflection is only partially revealed, but provides the context for my understanding of myself as particular, because I do not think of myself as the room, but rather as a particular thing in the room. Whatever my mind may be, it is distinct from the body it is housed in, and this is of unquestionable importance. Great care must be given to this distinction, because it is entirely possible that the room is constitutive of how we see the world and our reflection in it. The window is as much a part of the room as the reflected room that occupies that upon which I reflect, which means a different window can produce a different reflective position to observe the I of the self. The distinction goes deeper than that, because it is also the case that my mind is distinct from my conscious awareness of it, which is why it is possible for me to reflect upon I-hood at all. That is, there is a thing that reflects upon the thing that knows itself, and here we have additional limits to our being. Fichte will use this to posit a relationship to otherness that hinges on an idea of recognition. That I am an act of self-positing. I exist precisely because I am able to posit myself in the world, both imaginatively and actually. I can imagine myself outside in ways that are possible, bundled against the cold, and impossible, flying home after this lecture. But I can also go outside. That is, I can determine to move about the world according to what I want. In moving about the world as a self-determining, self-positing I, it is inevitable, if there are others in the world, that I should encounter another in the world. This encounter places me and the other into a relationship of recognition, where the I that constitutes I am is recognized as another, while I am recognizing the other as such. So this sort of antagonism of mutual recognition where both entities recognize another in the world. This act of recognition brings my being into the world in a particular way. To clarify this point, think of what it is to recognize a landmark, a particular tree, for instance, that indicates you're almost home. Ah, there's the giant red oak. I'm only a few minutes away from home. This act of recognition is not mutual. The red oak is not aware of you in the same way that a neighbor is. And we know this because when we see our neighbor see us, we are inclined to wave. But we make no such effort on behalf of the tree as we pass. How we encounter the otherness which recognizes us can potentially be further complicated by the constitution of the otherness we encounter, or subsequent othernesses that we encounter. Hegel understands this process to be dialectic in nature, where our being encounters its antithesis in the being of another, and the ensuing struggle for dominance establishes the ground of social being, which then becomes a new dialectical thesis. Fichte and Hegel are filtered through the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl to produce the Heideggerian ideas of Dasein and thrownness. For Heidegger, our existence is the result of being thrown into the world, and as such, this means our being is one best understood as being present to, which is a presence made manifest in a totality of beings and doings. For instance, this is Heidegger's example, so I'm just stealing this from him, but nevertheless, it's a good example. A hammer is just an object. But it is an object for hammering. But with nothing to hammer, it remains an object intelligible only as an object. The act of hammering is understood not merely as an action, but in the context of what hammering does, produces a building. So a hammer hammers, but we can only understand hammering as an activity after we have hammered something. Yeah, did you get that? You good? All right. So what is it that a thinking thing does? If we're going to agree with Descartes that we are a thinking thing. Let us replace hammer with thinking thing and see what happens. A thinking thing is just an object, but it is an object for thinking. But with nothing to think, it remains an object intelligible only as an object. The act of thinking is understood not merely as an action, but in the context of what thinking does. But what does thinking do? What does it produce? If a thinking thing thinks, but we can only understand thinking as an activity after we have thought something, how are we supposed to reach a point of critical reflection that allows us to know what we are other than an object which can think? Perhaps stated more provocatively, a hammer can be misused to smash, but this is not properly hammering. Similarly, a thinking thing can think, but how do we know that it's being done properly? Here in Heidegger, we have come full circle in the attempt to approach an understanding of otherness. I say we have come full circle because Heidegger's philosophy is the culmination of German idealism and broader phenomenological projects, beginning in the Enlightenment, produced the existentialism that defines so much of contemporary philosophy and social life. But this arc is only half of the loop. The other half of the loop originates in the mechanistic worldview of the early Enlightenment that draws upon Aristotelian science to explain the world and is best captured by the dictum of Francis Bacon that nature exhibits herself more clearly when vexed than when left to herself. How does the I opposed to otherness come to think about itself in a self-positing way? Here we must venture farther back in the Enlightenment to begin to see the narrative arc of our thinking about otherness take shape. In our previous discussions, we have spent a lot of time thinking about the context of Adam's inhabiting of the world. Previously, I claimed that the existential crisis begins with Adam even before the existential crisis that forms in the aftermath of eating forbidden fruit. The existential crisis is forced upon Adam in a way that betokens Heidegger's idea of thrownness and gives us a clear glimpse of the existential problem. The existential problem is that we have never managed to reconcile the otherness of our own being with the way our being is constituted. That is, we look for otherness outside of ourselves and find it precisely because it is our own alien nature that is the basis of our self-positing self-reflection. God routinely self-references by exclaiming, "I am," or "I am who I am." And though there are numerous ways to interpret this exclamation, it is beyond doubt that God is making a claim about being. However, it also raises an interesting question about the question God is asked by Moses in Exodus 3:14. Moses asks God what he, Moses, shall tell the Israelites when they ask who sent him, and he is told to tell them, "I am sent him." There is no confusion on God's part about what God is, but the utterance God uses is a verb form in Hebrew that cannot be translated into the first person. Moses modifies God's utterance to accommodate this problem. But in reality, the problem is that the statement could be interpreted as an evasion. I am who I am. Don't bother yourself with the details. Right? It could be read as a confirmation of God's nature as a supreme being. Right? I am who exists. Or less likely, but still possible and gaining traction in today's discourse, as a self-cause. I am because I am. All of which are reasonable interpretations of that phrase in the Hebrew. The Hebrew phrase is difficult because grammatically it can be rendered as I was, I am, or I will be. All three of those are reasonable interpretations of God's response to Moses' question. And the only person who could rightly know which grammatical approach is correct is the person that was in the conversation with God, Moses himself. The takeaway here is that God does not give a name to him, her, or itself, but rather states his, her, or itself existence as its identity. God is nameless. Naming is a critical function of being as we understand and experience it. The first encounter with naming as an act is Genesis 2, verses 19 and 20, when God abdicates responsibility for his creation to Adam and has Adam name the creatures of the earth and sky. But after Adam had sat through what must have been a tediously long and creatively exhausting experience, not a single creature made by God was found to be a suitable companion for Adam. That is, even after undergoing a process of perpetual recognition with all of creation, Adam found himself isolated and alone, a unique condition in all of creation. The ability to name is an overt act of domination, which is a responsibility that lies outside God's expectation that Adam will act as viceroy in Eden. God requires Adam to exert his will over creation, and in doing so, Adam's otherness is brought into stark relief. Naming is an act of will meant to bring the unknown into the known. It is meant to give shape and definition to the essence of a thing. Anything solid and heavy can be used to beat a nail into a board, but this act of hammering is not hammering at all. A hammer is what hammers, and a hammer is understood because of hammering. Merely hammering with something, banging an object together, does not make something a hammer. God's refusal to give a name to his, her, or its own existence, whatever the motivation, identifies quite clearly the problem of our experience of otherness inherent in our being. We are namers of things, but we do not name ourselves. Indeed, we do not even know what it is that is to be named. Otherness is key to understanding the existential problem, because once we lose sight of the relevance and resemblance of otherness in others as an act of self-positing, it is too easy to not only misconstrue the virtue and value of others, it is also easily maligned in ourselves. The act of naming, or of withholding a name, is used to great effect by Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale. In one of her recollections, Atwood's narrator relates this insight to her readers. "My name isn't Offred. I have another name, which nobody uses now because it's forbidden. I tell myself it doesn't matter. Your name is like your telephone number, useful only to others. But what I tell myself is wrong. It does matter. I keep the knowledge of this name like something hidden, some treasure I'll come back to dig up one day. I think of this name as buried. This name has an aura around it, like an amulet, some charm that survived from an unimaginably distant past. I lie in my single bed at night with my eyes closed, and the name floats there behind my eyes, not quite within reach, shining in the dark." Imagine the horror of all of creation, to be paraded before Adam to be named, an act of ownership, domination, and erasure, all at once. Compare this to Craig Johnson's use of naming in his popular Longmire series, where the main character, Walt Longmire, comes to be in possession of a canine companion and simply refers to the animal as dog. The animal, 12 books into the series, bears no name but the one Adam gave to it. This is as close as an animal can come to self-ownership, to have only been named once. But we are inheritors of that act of naming.